US President Joe Biden has addressed the nation from the Oval Office, outlining the reasons that led him to withdraw from the presidential race. This was Biden's first address since he announced his decision to step aside. He has revealed that what pushed him to his decision after weeks of withstanding persistent pressure, saying he had to unite his party if democracy was to be defended.
I revere this office, but I love my country more. It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think is more important than any title. I draw strength and I find joy in working for the American people. But this sacred task of perfecting our union is not about me. It's about you, your families, your futures. It's about we, the people. And we can never forget that. And I never have.
Biden stuck to his belief that his vision for the country merited a second term, but his speech reflected his awareness of the voices calling on him to stand down. The president acknowledged that there is a time and a place for long years of experience and a time and a place for new voices.
I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation.
Biden asserted that for the rest of his term, he'd be focused on doing his job as president. He ticked off a list of his administration's policy initiatives, knowing that this would be his chance to shape how history views his one and only term in office. Now, Biden once again endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris to become the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. Passing on the torch, Biden expressed his love and gratitude for the belief that Americans have shown in him. And with an eye on the presidential race, he backed the Democratic Party's bid, saying America is at an inflection point and has to choose between hope and hate, between unity and division.
We have to decide, do we still believe in honesty, decency, respect, freedom, justice, and democracy? In this moment, we can see those we disagree with not as enemies, but as fellow Americans. Can we do that?
All right, viewers, we're now being joined by Spencer Critchley, who's the former communication advisor on the Obama campaign and a renowned author. We're also joined by our correspondent, Susan Tehrani, who's joining us live from New York. Welcome. Susan, welcome, Mr. Critchley. I wanted to start with Mr. Critchley first. Sir, what were your key takeaways from the speech? It was a short speech, and in the beginning itself, he did mention, passing the baton to the new generation. He did also mention personal ambition. What were your key takeaways hearing what he said?
The speech was a demonstration of his key point, which is that this is about saving democracy. In willingly relinquishing power, he's repeating one of the foundational acts of democracy that goes back really to the Roman Republic, when the general Cincinnatus was called to be a dictator to save the Roman Republic, which he managed to do in 16 days, and then immediately relinquished power and went back to his farm. Because of that, George Washington, one of the founders of the United States, was called the American Cincinnatus because he did something very similar. After serving two terms in office, he was so popular that he knew he could have stayed in office for the rest of his life and essentially ruled as a king, but instead he willingly left office for the good of democracy and returned in effect to his farm. And Joe Biden has done the same thing. And recently the US Supreme Court issued a decision that in effect give some forms of absolute power to American presidents. And Joe Biden's response to that was to say, I do not want that power, because that would be potentially fatal for our democracy. So as I say, I think this speech, not just in the content, but in the act of giving it, was one of the most powerful demonstrations of commitment to democracy imaginable, and a demonstration of what is at stake in this election, because he's right.
Mr. Crashley. Yes.
Donald Trump is seeking to overturn democracy.
Mr. Crashley, I'd just like to come in there, as you said that, it's his commitment, and, when he says things like personal ambition, he wants to put it aside, give a chance to the new generation. Where do you feel these thoughts were just up till a few weeks ago? Because he was adamant that he's ready to go in for a second term.
I think that really the truth is that he believed that he could overcome the odds, as he has done so many times in his career, which stretches back 52 years in politics. And so often he's been right when people, including experts, have told him there's no way he can win, and he's proved them wrong, including when he became elected president. And I think that that's part of the key to his success, is that sheer refusal to quit. And I think that that was his response this time to bad polling data. But from very well-sourced reporting, it appears that he was not fully aware of just how bad some of these polls had become. And I think it was right for the tone of the event this evening that he didn't talk about polls. But I would imagine the truth is he looked at polls that were not just unfavorable, but showed a very real likelihood that he would lose. And as he said, the cost would be too much.
So it's the numbers that he's looking at, and perhaps that made him reflect on his decision to stand down. Mr. Crashley, stay with us. I'd just like to now come to Susan Tehrani. She's joining us from New York. Susan, any initial thoughts of yours and any reactions that you've picked up so far?
Yeah, as our guest rightly noted, President Biden really talked about the defense of democracy, saying it's more important than anything else. But many Americans, including those 14 and 15 million that voted for him in the primaries, wanted him to talk about his health. They wanted to be addressed as people that supported him before this transfer to Kamala Harris. And another thing that many Americans wanted to hear, including myself, is why really did he decide to step aside?
Yes.
The defense for democracy, this is a speech that could have been given any time. And the question remains, as you rightly mentioned, somewhere between Saturday evening and Sunday night, it dawned on him that he cannot serve another 4-year term, when just a few weeks ago, even the president himself, not only his family, but himself, said that only God Almighty could come down and make this decision for me. Nonetheless, he did endorse Kamala Harris, and he also talked about what he wants to do and made very clear that he wants to stay a president. He talked about Russia, Gaza, bringing home the hostages. Domestically, he talked about gun control, climate change, reform to the Supreme Court, which many will talk about in the next few days. And he also talked about his cancer moonshot institution initiative, which is to essentially cure cancer. But President Biden ultimately, and this is no disrespect, he's making these promises as a lame duck president.
Susan, now, there are two ways of looking at it. One, you see him as a president, and then you see him as an 81-year-old. When you see him as an 81-year-old, you want to say, okay, fine, let's not probe further. But he is the US president. So if I were to just be very vocal about my thoughts, when he said all the right things, that he wants to put personal ambition aside, he wants to unite the nation, it's for the sake of democracy. But do you feel this is too little, too late, or is he giving do you feel he's giving a higher moral ground to his decision of stepping aside too late into this campaign, with just 3 months left for November?
Yeah, the Harris campaign now has about 105 days to, gain the support of the country, not only the base. And he really so late in the game, stepping down. And you take into consideration the reporting that we were hearing and the inside struggle within the Democratic Party, where the president himself and his family were adamant that he will continue running. And then powerful voices like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, former President Barack Obama, and others behind the scene were really pushing him to step aside, whether for old age, whether or not they saw the polling that he couldn't win, whether or not it was his health. But nonetheless, there is just this contrast. But let's talk about what he did want to present. And I think he presented this to his base, at least. And that was that democracy is important. I will pass the torch. And I just want to remind you that back in 2020, when he was elected, this reflects something that he said back then, but then changed his mind. He said that he was going to be a transitional president. He said that he will ultimately have to pass the torch to a younger generation. He said that at the beginning of his first term. So, this reflects that.
Susan, thank you for giving us your thoughts. Mr. Crashley, I'd just like to come back to you. When, he says it's time for the new generation to come in, is it too little too late for the new generation with just the number of months left for this next presidential campaign to end?
So, in general, it's not too little too late. Much of the work that goes into a U.S. presidential campaign, which now seems to be perpetual, people seem to just continuously be running for president these days, ends up being largely wasted. And it's only in the final few months of the campaign, especially the last month or two, that most people end up making up their minds. It's largely a standoff very often for all of the time before then. Furthermore, the launch of the Kamala Harris campaign is one of the most extraordinary launches I've ever seen. I think that many people have ever seen. I was not expecting this. It's truly amazing. The incredible outpouring of support, the virtually instantaneous endorsements from all of her potential rivals. It only took her like 2 days to get all of the delegate commitments she needed. And the campaign went from attracting, I think, a few hundred volunteers a week to, last time I checked, which was yesterday, 58,000 new volunteers and 40,000 new young voter registrations. This is an incredible upsurge of support. So, no, in this case, I don't think, in general, I think it would not necessarily be too late. And in this case, it's definitely not too late.
All right, Mr. Spencer Crashley, I hear you. I get your point. You find, there is commitment in Joe Biden still. And of course, Kamala Harris, her campaign has started on a good note. And of course, there will be a lot to track. You still feel that in the last 2 months is when the decisions are taken. And as Susan pointed out, we're just 105 days out from the final day. Thank you so much for joining in. That was Spencer Crashley, former communications advisor in the Obama campaign, renowned author. And of course, Susan Tehrani getting us the latest from New York. Susan, we will be keeping in touch with you through the course of the day. Mr. Crashley, thank you so much for joining in.
My pleasure.